We are going to start stitching this design with the castle. And one of the most common questions that I see from beginners, or that I get from beginners, is where to start stitching. And you know, that is the first question I ask myself when I sit down to start actually stitching a new design. So sometimes there are specific reasons to start in one place versus another. Often that reason for me is if something is in front of or behind something else. So if one part's going to be flat and one part is going to be raised, then I tend to do the part that's going to be behind first. There is not necessarily a specific reason we're starting with the castle. Yes, these flowers down here and leaves will be in front of the castle, so that was part of my decision. But also, I just wanted to start on this fun, beautiful castle, okay? It is the main part of this design, really the most distinctive part. So we are going to use a stitch called a brick stitch. And I like to stitch the brick stitch with it going vertically. So I'm going to turn this hoop in my stand so that it looks like that. And then we will come back and I will talk to you more about the brick stitch. Brick stitch is really just a row or rows of back stitches that where the ends of the back stitches are staggered. Just like, think of a row of bricks, you know, how one brick ends here and one ends here and the one underneath it is like that, offset. Let me show you what I mean. This will be a little bit clearer. So as I said, you can work brick stitch left to right, right to left, or vertically. I prefer vertically. But so let's say you've got a back stitch, and then you've got the next back stitch, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And then when you come to do the next row, you're going to start like if this is the end of the shape you're filling, the side edge, you're going to do a half stitch. And then you will do a full stitch from the halfway point of this one to the halfway point of that one, halfway point of this stitch to here. And then when you get to the end again, you will do a half stitch, you know, depending on your shape. So then when you come to the next stitch, the next row, you'll go back just like this first row that you did. You'll do a full stitch, and then a full stitch, full stitch, full stitch, full stitch. So that's pretty simple, right? But the brick stitch is, I'll admit, it's not necessarily my favorite stitch, and as simple as it seems like it does take almost more concentration than some other, perhaps more complicated stitches. And let me explain why that is. Brick stitch is not necessarily, it's not a complicated stitch, but the stitch length is pretty crucial. And I am a stitcher who tends to stitch pretty small. Sometimes if I have a choice between longer or some, shorter or longer stitches, I kind of come in and do really short stitches. I have to remind myself when I'm doing brick stitch to make particularly that very first stitch longer than my instincts want to make it. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to skip these crenellations up here and I'm going to start beneath this kind of wider section. So I'm going to make right along here my first row of stitches. I'm going to come up, and the reason it is important to make this stitch longer than you might think of making it, that length right there, I know it's maybe hard to tell, but it's probably 1/4 inch. So if I make that stitch, I'm using 3 strands here, and I chose 3 because I wanted to have enough bulk to really, for the stitches to show up. And so now I will do the next stitch, and I'm going to go right in the end of the other one. And if you have seen my video about backstitch, you have heard me say that, again, it's one of those stitches that's really simple, but it doesn't necessarily come out perfectly when you start, because it's hard to get a straight line with a backstitch. I don't know how else to say it. And when you're doing brick stitch, Not so much right in here because this is this inside the shape, but when we talk about these towers, that first line being really straight is important. So now I'm going to finish up this row. And another thing that I sometimes don't like about backstitch is that it leaves these indentations in between. And sometimes, you know, that's not what you want. If you're trying to get a smooth line, like for lettering or something, you don't want it to look kind of like a dashed line. But that's what works for brick stitch because you can actually see the separation between the stitches. Now I'm about to do something here that I don't always do. Backstitch, you know, you come up and you go down here, and then you underneath you jump up beyond the stitch and you come back to it. Well, right here, I'm going to do that fudging thing. Sometimes it's called thread saving, where because on this stitch I went down right here, I can come up, making sure I'm right at the, right at the end of that stitch, and I'm going to go down. So, you know, because all of these stitches are going to be all, you know, mushed together, you can do that thread saver stitch if you want to. Just make sure you are coming up. Well, you'll know what I mean. You like if you go up here and down here, I'm sorry, if you come up here and go down here, you can't also come up here. But so now I'm ready to do the second row. So now I have to do a half stitch. I mean, I could jump from here and start back here, but I'm right up here. So I'm gonna, now I've worked from bottom to top. Now I'm gonna work from top to bottom. If you're working left to right, you know. So now, but see, so now I have to make a half stitch. And if I had made each of these stitches shorter than this little half stitch here is gonna be just minuscule. So that's why I have to really remind myself to make the stitches long enough that I'm not just making the teeny tiniest little half stitches and they're just so tedious to make. And I'm making sure that this row is right next to the previous row. And I'm judging, always coming up halfway, in the halfway point of the stitch next to it. If you're working left to right or right to left, it'll be the stitch above it or below it. One more full length stitch. And now it's time for another half stitch. And there are 2 rows of brick stitch. Really, it is simple, but the main thing I can tell you is make sure you're making them long enough so that your half stitches aren't just completely invisible. Let me talk to you again about that thread saver technique I was talking about. I don't think I was very clear before. So now I've just finished here and I'm going to work on going back up on this row. So I'm going to make my first stitch, come up here, and go down here. So in a normal back stitch, I would come up, I would skip ahead and come up right here. See that? And I would come back and go down here. But because this stitch, I came up here and I went down here, I can come up right where that stitch ended and go down here. Backstitch is kind of a thread hog because you've got all that, you know, you're jumping ahead and coming back and jumping ahead and coming back. You've got a lot of thread left on the back. So if you just want to save a little thread and not have to thread a needle quite as often, you can use this technique on brick stitch. So now on this stitch, since I went down here, I can't come up there. Now I do have to do a regular back stitch where I jump ahead and come back. Sometimes I don't like that technique if I'm trying to get a really smooth line because I feel like coming up right where a stitch ends sometimes brings the other threads up. But you know, like I said, these just get all kind of mushed together and it will be fine. For these crenellations at the top of this section of the castle, the crenellations are those little kind of up and down, zigzag back and forth, little square edge on the top of like a balcony. And so I just did satin stitch for those. I didn't bother with little half stitches because they're just, that little space is too small. So each of those little square sections just has about 4 satin stitches in a row. And now I'm back to a long row of my brick stitch again. And I will do that until I get over to this line right here, and I'm going to leave a little space because I'm going to do something else there. For this line that runs across the top of this section of wall, I am going to use couching, the couching stitch. I'm going to use this brown color, and couching stitch uses two different components. There's what's called a surface thread, and then there is a couching thread. And the surface thread, here I am using 6 strands of this brown color, and I am going to use 1 strand to couch that thread. Couching really just means you're just going to stitch it down. So I'm going to start down here, come up, and I have these on 2 different needles. You can always this first one you can pull it through. If you only have 1 needle, you can now take this thread off of that needle because we're not going to be going in and out of the fabric again until we get to the end. So this thread is going to lay onto the fabric. Let me see if you can see that. It's going to lay on the fabric like that, and then I'm going to come up. This is my 1 strand. Get this one out of the way for a moment. So since I'm right-handed, I control the couching thread, the surface thread with this hand, and I stitch with this hand. I'm going to try to get my hand to not, oops, sorry about that, to not get in the way so you can see what I'm doing. So now I'm going to lay this thread down. And this is a simple one because it's just a straight line. I'm going to come up on one side of the thread. This is the 1 strand, and then go over the thread and down on the other side, and that will hold that in place. I'll jump up about 1/4 inch, come up on one side, go down on the other. Doesn't matter which side you come up first. This is a great stitch for curves when you need a nice solid line, because this is just one unbroken thread. Doesn't go in and out of the fabric, so you can get nice curves. If I'm doing curves, I will put these couching stitches much closer together to really hold the curve in place. But since this is just a straight line, don't need that many, just to hold it down. Now that I've come to the end of the line that I am couching, I'm going to come back to the needle that has these 6 strands on it. Okay, that's this one, and I'm just going to go down. Get it to catch on the screw. Okay, then I'm just going to pull that to the back, and I have room for 1 more row of couching here. Now it's going to be a little tricky since I went down right there. I'm going to try to come up right next to it without coming up in the same place. Did it work? Whoops, I accidentally pulled the... Well, see, that's a problem. All right, see this? I actually pulled up the couching thread, the 1 strand, and it's like caught in there. So I'm gonna have to go to the back, and I can't work it loose. Well, no, wait. Ooh, I have a mess on the back though. Okay, I gotta go get that knotted mess on the back figured out. I'll be right back. I had a horrible mess of a knot back there, but that happens. So I'm back on track now, and I did forget to mention that for the surface thread, I'm using 6 strands, and I did not separate these. Always, I can't think of another stitch that I don't separate. If I'm using 6-stranded embroidery thread, that I don't strip it to separate the strands. I want this to sort of stay like a cord. There's no reason to separate it. So anyway, 6 strands, just like it comes out of the skein, but now I'm ready to get going again and couch this line just like I did the other line. And I'll just go on the left side for that one. So anyway, that's all there is to couching. Hopefully you will not get a knot as bad as I did. Now let's talk about the towers. So far what we have stitched, this section in here, and you could have gone ahead and done this part too, have been flat. In other words, on the building, these walls are flat. You know, they have no dimension to them. But the towers are round. You know, they have dimension, they're round. And so another very common question when you're stitching is, how do I make one thing look like it's in front of or behind another, or how do I make it stand apart from something that it's stitched right next to? This is very common when you're talking about flower petals, when you have one petal that looks like one petal's underneath and one is on top of it, but it's not, it's literally just flat stitching. How do you separate those visually so they don't just look like one big blob? Same thing here. How do I make the tower not just flow visually into this wall, just look like it's all one color? To do that, you can do it with either actual dimension, like by padding this or making it, you know, actually raise up above the fabric. We're not doing that here. You can do it with color and contrast, and that's what we'll be doing here. Briefly, what I mean by color is if I'm trying to make one petal look in front of another petal, or one object on top of or in front of another one, if I make this one a brighter color and this one a darker color, see how even here you see the shadow right there along where they meet. If I make this one darker and this one brighter, this one looks like it's in front of. Brighter will bring it forward. Contrast is the other thing. So same thing, you know, like lighter or darker color, but also even a lighter, darker shade of the same color. So like if I was talking about color, if I'm doing a flower, I could do a bright pink here and a dark maroon under here. But if I'm doing all these yellows, what I would do is I would use like a darker yellow, in other words, in this case, brown, and then a lighter brown and then a lighter yellow and a lighter yellow in the center. Okay, so that's what we're doing with these towers. We are only going to use three actual colors of thread, but I'm going to use a technique that will make that look like 5 colors, and let me explain how that works. I'll pop in right here and say that I spent a lot of time, and my original plan was to make these towers actually dimensional. I was going to figure out some way to pad it and put something underneath there or build up layers or whatever. And I decided against that. I'm going to do a technique similar to that somewhere else. But for this, I decided to simplify it a little bit. But here is the technique I am using to make it look like they are rounded. These are the 3 colors we're using: a brown, this kind of golden yellow, and this brighter yellow. To make 5 colors out of these 3, here's what I'm doing. And I have these made up already on my needle. Let's see if I can get these to show up for you. Hang on, get out of the way there. All right, let me arrange these for you. So we're using 3 strands, just like we did for the brick stitch we're using the same stitch, same brick stitch, just like we used 3 strands to do this part. I have made up a range of colors by varying the number of strands in each of these. So this one right here, when I have a piece of, I organize my felts this way, especially when I'm doing color shading like this. I have a strip of felt that I have hanging on the wall over here next to me, so it's right within reach, next to my desk, and I put them in the felt just like this, so I can see I've got dark, not as dark, medium, a little bit brighter, and the brightest. So this one is just 3 strands of this brown thread. Sorry for this sad little skein, but it's the one I've been using, so I'm almost finished with this skein. But anyway, this one, the darkest, is 3 strands of that darkest brown. This next one is 2 strands of dark and 1 strand of the sort of golden yellow. So 2 of these and 1 of this. This one in the middle is 3 strands, just three strands, all the same, of the medium golden yellow. This one, now I'm introducing a little bit of the lighter color. So now I have I have one strand of the golden yellow and one strand of the bright yellow. And then this one, the lightest, is just 3 strands of the bright yellow. So do you see how that works? We've got the darkest, we added a little bit of the next brighter color, and then we've got the medium color. And then I added some of the lighter color to the medium to this one, and then this was just all of the lightest color. So that will give us a range of colors. While you're stitching, you might be thinking, these look really similar, I don't see any difference, but as it builds up, it really does make a difference. I should have said from the very beginning, ignore on this one, ignore those lines that are running horizontally, so sort of curved lines. Forget that. That was my original plan, is to stitch the towers in a curve, but that was just too tedious. So that's why I switched the towers being stitched vertical brick stitches and the walls being stitched horizontally. That's another way that I am differentiating between the wall and the tower, is a different stitch direction. But so just ignore those horizontal lines and pay attention to the vertical ones that I've drawn. You'll have the vertical ones on your pattern, okay? And so I've already done the first line of stitching here. And I think I mentioned way back when we started about straight lines and backstitch. I also recently did an Instagram reel about when it had been weeks since I had stitched, and I had started over here and I put in the first line and it was just all wonky, crooked. I mean, it had been so long since I'd stitched, all of my reflexes and hand, brain, eye coordination was just not there. So I had to rip it out and do it again, because when you're starting out on the very first line of brick stitch, it is important, especially when it's just on the edge. Like up in here, not as big of a deal because there's stitching all cramped up against it. But there's nothing on the left side of this tower. And like over here, there's nothing on the right side. So I really want this first line that I'm stitching to be really super straight. Once I get stitching all inside here, I'm going to still try to keep them straight, but it's just not as critical. But I've already put in the first line of my brown. So that's just those 3 strands that are all the same brown. Everything else is the same as we talked about over here with brick stitch. Same thing, make sure your stitches are long enough so that you don't have those little tedious, tiny, tiny half stitches. Now I am switching to the thread. So I've only just put 1 line of the darkest brown. I'm just switching to the strands that have 2 strands of the darkest brown and 1 strand of that sort of golden yellow. But otherwise, it is the same. I'm doing a half stitch to start because that's right next to a long stitch, and I will make a row, and knots back there, a row of these. And already, it's really hard to tell on here, but already you're thinking that just doesn't look any different. It looks like the same exact color. But like I said, I promise that it's a subtle difference, but it does make a difference. Sometimes a little bit of that lighter color will peek through, or sometimes the darker color will peek through. Do a half stitch right here. All right. I'm now going to switch to the 3 strands, just the 3 solid strands of the medium golden color. And I'm keeping in mind that right down the center here, this is the center section right here, I'm going to have probably 1 row of the lightest yellow. So how many rows you put of each one will vary, maybe just slightly. Like this tower right here is much wider than this one. So obviously right here, I'm not going to need, 4 rows of the golden yellow because it's so skinny. Over here, I did a few more rows of just the golden yellow and maybe 2 rows of the lightest. So just kind of use your judgment. Use these sections that are on the pattern as sort of guidelines, but keep in mind you're going to go dark, medium, light, and then you're going to go back medium, a little bit darker, darker. So anyway, I am doing the 3 strands of golden yellow, and now this time I'll do a few more rows. because those darker ones on the edges are just indicating that it's rounded around to the back. But I generally want these to look, I don't want them to be brown towers, I want them to be golden yellow towers. Okay, so I will go add a couple of rows of this color. And I realize I completely forgot the actual first step for this tower. I got so excited about talking to you about the shading that I completely forgot. The first thing you want to do before you fill in all of the rows on the tower, the yellow, golden rows of yellow, is to stitch the windows. And for the windows, I'm using 2 strands, and this is one of the threads that I dyed. This was, I think this is the 718, that kind of maroon color of DMC thread that I then put the blue marker on top. But it comes out a very, very dark maroon navy color. So anyway, 2 strands, just a satin stitch. I'm going to stitch these windows because it's much easier to go ahead and stitch them now instead of leaving a hole. That's the right shape when you're doing all that other stitching. So go ahead and do the windows first. That's always a question when you've got, spots on top in the middle of a bunch of satin stitching or some sort of fill stitch, or if you've got dots or, some sort of little bitty shape inside some a filling stitch, is whether to do the little detail thing first and then stitch around it, or to do solid filling stitch, and then it's really on a case-by-case basis. These shapes are big enough that I wanted to go ahead and stitch them, that I can more easily stitch up to and around them. So see that, I don't know if you can see this, but that pretty variegation is coming through. The first window is kind of a dark navy, and this one is kind of more of a maroon color. So anyway, totally forgot to tell you about the windows. Stitch those first. I think I've done 5 rows of this medium golden color with the 3 strands that are all the same. And something to talk about on this tower and this tower is these towers are tapered at the top. This one, this one and this one are, parallel. They're even all the way up. So you're going to have to fudge just a little, like make your rows a little bit closer together up here. And by the time you get down here, maybe space them apart just a teeny bit wider. But if you just need to fill in some space under here because, you have to bring the top in just, a little bit, just do that. So now I'm going to switch to the next color, which is going to be let me go grab it. It's this one. It has 2 strands of the light yellow and 1 strand of that medium gold. I think I did 2 rows of that one, and now I'm going to do a center row, column I guess you'd say, line of the solid bright yellow. So this is 3 strands of all one color, which is the brightest yellow. And when I'm saying I'm putting in this many rows or that many rows, if your rows are different, that is perfectly fine. Honestly, I think over on this side, I think I wrote it down and I ended up with more rows of one of those colors than I did on this side. But, just pay attention to the area you're trying to fill and just shoot to have this lightest color of yellow be right up the center. And I do believe I'm going to have to fudge it down here because up here, if you'll see, I have really just room for 1 row before it's time to change colors, but down here I have so I might add just a few more stitches down here. But anyway, once you get across to the center with the lightest yellow, just work to the other side of the tower in reverse. Just reverse the colors, the shading of the colors. On these little angled sections of the sort of under roof part, again, ignore the lines that are there. Totally changed my plan. And what we're going to use here is a satin stitch, again 3 strands, and I'm just keeping it to 2 colors. I'm putting the darkest brown, I think it's 434, on the edges, and then a middle section of the golden yellow. Again, all 3 strands are the same color, the golden yellow, and then identical to this side is on this side, a little section of the dark brown. And because this is a little tiny section, and we're using satin stitch, and so what will, and because it's in an arc, you know, you've got well, let me explain what I'm talking about. So let me show you this way. So you have a little section, it goes like this. And you've got brown here, and that'll be the yellow. All right, so you see on this side, on the top side, you have a wider area to place each stitch, and down here it is narrower. So with parallel satin stitch, every stitch is exactly parallel like that. But I can't do that on here because I can't fit as many stitches on, I can't go down in as many places on this place because there's not as much room as there's across here. That sounds a little confusing, I know. And this little area is so tiny, it's not that big of a deal. As you get larger areas and more stitches, this technique, I call it satin stitching in an arc. Some people call it tucking your stitches. But let me explain what I'm talking about because it will probably come into play later on in this design. So let me switch colors here. Go to a different color, maybe this one. If this one will work. Okay, so I can make my first stitch. Oh look, it's not really going to work. So I can make my first stitch just regular. And I come along, all right, switching back. That one did not want to work. Hang on, let me get the pink again. Okay, so we do our first stitch. And then I can do this stitch. And as I come along, when I get to along about here, maybe it just depends. I may need to. Again, this is such a small area. This won't really come into play here, but so I can put the next stitch right next to here, but maybe I need to put this stitch down like in the same hole. I could do that. I can come down and put it in the same hole. So I can subtly change my angle so that by the middle I'm going straight up and down. So this one could be the same, but now maybe it's time to change the angle and I could come down in the same hole. And by the middle, I'm going straight up and down. Obviously you wouldn't extend the stitch that long. If in really extreme cases, not here so much, but let's say I had a really extreme arc going on. So let's say this is a petal. So you come in, you do your first stitch and you've got to keep going. But by now, suddenly I have a teeny bit amount of space and then I got to spread these out. So I come up next to that one. But when I go to here, I would only go about 3/4 or a little more than 3/4. And then the next stitch, I could go make a full stitch. And then this stitch, I would maybe go halfway. And then the next stitch, I would go maybe 3/4. And then this stitch, I would cover it and I would come all the way, make a full stitch. And that allows you to fit more stitches in when you have less space right here. It's a little hard because this pink marker is all running together. It makes a little more sense with thread, but you just shorten a certain number of stitches depending on how tight your arc is. And that way they kind of get tucked under there, and then this full stitch covers up that those stitches that are not full length. Again, that's an extreme shape, and we are just not talking quite that extreme. But see here, I've got this strong angle this way, and I need to adjust to an angle that is now like this angle. So I'm just very slightly, maybe I'll go down in the same hole where that brown stitch before it went down. And that will begin to change the angle. And now this one, I'll come pretty close to it down here on the bottom side, the narrow side. And now I'm kind of going right. I've got my angle pretty well set here for a while. But anyway, each of these towers has a little angled section. This one has one here. can't really see it, a little teeny skinny one. This one has a little skinny one, and this one is identical over here. So anyway, that's how to satin stitch these little angled sections of the roof. I will just tell you this next part. I don't think you have to watch me stitch it, but for this line that goes across this tower and up here, this section, I've done 1 row, but I need to do probably 2 more rows. But that's going to be the couching stitch, just like we did down here on that part right here that we did across that wall. Same exact thing, 6 strands of the brown couched down with 1 strand. So do that on top of the stitching and do this across here. And then this little section of this tower is brick stitched. It's a kind of a tight, it's a little small area. This little area right here that goes across is the angled satin stitch, like right here. And then this little shield thing, I used 3 strands of the brightest yellow and just satin stitched that oval first. And then I did a line of couching around the oval in the dark brown to make it really stand out. So you don't need to watch me stitch that. We've already done the couching stitch. So anyway, that's how to stitch those sections of those towers. I am starting the door by filling in this interior part, and I am using a split stitch to fill in the sections, and then I'm using just a single straight stitch, just a not couched, not anything, just 1 stitch from here to here for the dividers. To the blue thread that I'm using, I dyed up some of the 3846, that kind of light turquoise color, with the 443, the blue marker. And you do not have to do this. If you don't want to bother with this, I'm honestly not sure if I'm going to use this color someplace else on the design. If I do, then that'll be great. But if you just wanted to use the straight DMC 3846 for the door, that'd be fine. I just wanted a little bit of variety, variation in the color. The color I'm using for the dividers is the same one I used for the windows. And I am using, as I said, a split stitch to fill in. I love split backstitch, but split backstitch uses a lot more thread, and since this is a thread I've dyed, I don't want to, use it up super fast. So I'm using a split stitch. You can use any kind of filling stitch you want. I mean, if you like stem stitch better than split stitch, or you could do brick stitch again, it doesn't matter. I'm using 2 strands, and what I am doing, I am filling in a section and then making the 1 straight stitch. And then I'm filling in a section and putting a straight stitch. You could probably do the straight stitches first, but I kind of didn't want them to get buried, and I wanted to be able to really see the line. So that's just why I'm doing it that way. So I have just finished doing the split stitch on that section, and now I will do the straight stitch. This is, how many strands is this? I want to say this is 3 strands. All right, just 1 straight stitch. Normally, I would say that's kind of a long stitch to do 1 stitch, but it's maybe right on the outside of how long I would make 1 stitch, but it kind of gets buried in between the blues, the light blue stitches that you are doing. So I think it will be all right. So let me get this thread parked out of the way so that I don't pick it up by mistake. All right, now I'm ready to come do my split stitches, and these, it's just, like I said, you can use any stitch that works as a good filling stitch if you don't want to do these. I'm using 2 strands, don't know if I said that, and they just kind of get all mushed together. It's just a way to get some color on there. I tend to make my split stitches really small, and I'm having to remind myself not to make them teeny tiny because they're kind of hard. 2 strands it's hard to come up inside 2 strands. Split stitch, is where you make a stitch. Let me zoom in on that because it's hard to see. Hang on. All right, don't know if that's going to make much of a difference, but a split stitch is you just make a single stitch and then you come up inside right in the middle of it, and you come up inside of it and split those threads, and then you make another stitch and split, come up in the middle. Like I said, that's why sometimes it's hard with just 2 strands to find the place where you're splitting it. But it looks like a little teeny tiny chain stitch. It's not really looking that way on this section because I'm just mushing them all together, using it more like a filling stitch. And you know, if I was being really technical, I started up here and I worked my way down here, and I would, if I was trying to make the little texture look the exact same for each row, I would hop back up here and work down, but I don't really care. I'm really just trying to get some color. So I'm going to carefully, now I'm going to go from the bottom to the top, because it's just not going to matter. I'm really not doing this stitch to get that little chain stitch texture. I'm just doing it to fill an area with the color. So that's all there is for the interior of the door. And then we will come back and just, I'll do this, and then we'll come back and we'll work on the edging, the border of the door. I am now doing brick stitch, following the curve of the border of the door. And I am using, remember over here on the tower when we used 3 strands, and we used 2 strands of the lightest yellow and 1 strand of the sort of medium gold. I think it's 726 and 783. That is what I'm using here. This is a blended strands, and really just the same thing, the brick stitch all the way around. And I'm really liking the way it, the shape around the door really makes it stand out in that brighter yellow. All right, so do that. I think this is the 4th row that I'm doing right now. I am now couching the outside edge of this border for the door, but instead of using 6 strands, you know how over here when we did these lines across here, I used 6 strands and couched it with 1. That was just going to be too heavy. It was just going to sort of cover up too much of that lighter yellow. So I am using 3 strands of the brown and still couching it with 1 strand. So I debated not even doing any couching right here, but it did seem like it needed just a little bit more definition. So there is, there's that line. And to give the inside, the inside border some definition, I am not using the brown. I am using the same color that we used for these straight stitches along here, this purpley navy. And I'm using 2 strands. I just want a very small line that is just a darker line right there. And you could do a back stitch. I'm doing a very slight split stitch, really. It's just, you want just a little bit of a dark line that just sort of sinks down in between the door and the border. And that's all. I think it just really makes that door pop. For the roofs on the castle, we are going to use a needle painting technique. And I say a technique, but we're going to needle paint them, but we're going to break some rules. So I'm not going to show you how to do these right now. I will, in a later section, I'm going to show you how to do some needle painting and all the rules. And, I use the term rules loosely, but, all the things you need to do needle painting. And so after we do that, we will come back to these and do these a little bit later. So even though I'm not showing them to you right now, don't worry, they will get done.